Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you so much for watching. So yesterday, a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper drone collided with a Russian Su-27 fighter jet. Now, at first, the reports were it was a collision, which implied it was an accident. But then the reports started to claim that the Russian fighter jet was acting, quote, unprofessional around the drone, flying recklessly around it, spraying fuel on the drone in order to take it down. Now they're saying this was an act of direct aggression. Here's General Mark Milley today.
Russia launched and has continued for over a year now a war of aggression in flagrant violation of international law. This is and remains a Russian frontal assault on the rules-based international order that has been in place for 80 years, 8 decades since the end of World War II. In the face of this act of aggression, in a war of conquest, this group remains unified. NATO is united. The people of Ukraine are unyielding. They are standing steadfast in the face of the Russian onslaught. Russia remains isolated. Their military stocks are rapidly depleting. Their soldiers are demoralized, untrained, unmotivated conscripts and convicts, and their leadership is failing them. Having already failed in their strategic objectives, Russia is increasingly relying on other countries, such as Iran and North Korea, as the Secretary pointed out. They're using Iranian drones to continue to terrorize Ukrainian civilians. This relationship is built on the cruel bonds of oppressing freedom, subverting liberty, and maintaining their tyranny. Yet free people will not return to the shackles of tyranny. Ukrainians remain defiant, with steel in their spines and courage in their veins, and they have the broad support of the United States and the international community.
All right, well, let's hear from the Russians. We now have with us the first deputy to the UN, Russian Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky. Ambassador, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Kim. Thank you.
Well, what is your reaction to this? I mean, they're saying this is a big act of aggression, potentially, that, it sounds like the posturing is, it's more warmongering, definitely more marching towards that direction. What happened with this drone incident from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I must say that the general sounded somewhat Hollywoodish, I would say. So it definitely was meaning some kind of a movie, which I personally haven't seen, because the things that he referred to about my country and about the situation in Ukraine, I don't think that they correspond to reality. And a lot of experts are now pointing to this. And it's also very much illustrative that the general referred to the world's rules-based international order. He claimed that it is in force for 80 years, if I'm not mistaken. This is very important because it's not a rules-based international order that we all are obliged to observe, but international law. And these are not the same things. So rules-based international order means that there is a group of countries, in this case NATO countries, which set certain rules and ask other countries to obey to them. There was a joke at some point of time that Russia is threatening U.S. security because it has placed its territory too close to U.S. military bases. I think that the incident with the drone resembles this as well. The question is, what was a U.S. drone doing in Black Sea, thousands of miles from U.S. territory? The incident in question happened on the 14th of March. And we detected this unmanned aerial vehicle flying over the Black Sea near the Crimean Peninsula in the direction of the state border of the Russian Federation. So it flew with its transponders off. It violated the boundaries of the temporary airspace regime established for the special military operation. There was no communication with him. And our jets on duty, they had to scramble to identify him. And as it was explained by our Ministry of Defense, and I stick to this version, that as a result of quick maneuvering, the drone went into an unguided flight with a loss of altitude and collided with the water surface. The version that it was hit by one of our jets, frankly, to me, sounds a little bit laughable. because at such speeds, if a jet is affected by some object in the air, there would be immediate damage to this aircraft. But all our aircraft, they didn't use onboard weapons. Ministry of Defense claims that we didn't come into contact with this aerial vehicle, and all aircraft returned safely to their home airfield. And of course, it's important to note that this incident was caused by U.S. Actions of non-compliance with the flight restriction zone declared by Russian Federation, and this is a very dangerous developments. It reflects the increased reconnaissance activities against the interest of the Russian Federation by U.S. Aircraft in this region. So that's the version that I have. There were also clarifications in this regard by our ambassador to the United States, Mr. Antonov. There were negotiations, there were telephone conversations today, I think, at different levels between Moscow and Washington. And I think everybody is acknowledging that this is a very dangerous development, and it can be fraught with dangerous consequences if these provocations by the United States are not stopped.
Okay, so a couple of questions for you. So you mentioned that this drone that was flying near Crimea in the Black Sea, it was in international waters, but you're saying that the transponders were off on the drone, so it
Yes.
didn't have any signaling. And then you say that the drone, it spun out. Are you saying it spun out of control and then it ended up going into the water?
Yeah, because of some maneuvering. I don't know what was happening in reality, because of course I wasn't there and I haven't seen the video.
Right.
That's the version that was announced by
So-
by our Ministry of Defense. Yeah.
So I'm curious if this drone, from the Russian perspective, was this drone being aggressive, flying towards Crimea? It was doing something it shouldn't have been doing, or was it? Or do you think this drone possibly they had lost control of this drone? It sounds like there's a possibility that the U.S. military lost control of this drone. The transponders were off. This thing was acting weird, and then it collides. It plummages into the water. Is it possible this drone had just malfunctioned? Obviously, this was an unmanned drone, and now they're trying to blame Russia for maybe this drone just not operating the way it should have operated? Or do you think this was intentional aggression from the United States?
Well, I'm not an aviation expert, of course. It's very difficult for me to determine the exact circumstances. But one thing I know, that the drone was violating the boundaries of the temporary airspace regime. And these boundaries were well known by the United States. I think it's a part of deconflicting arrangements that are usually being agreed with great powers in such situation. So we think it was a deliberate provocation and very dangerous provocation.
This air zone that you're talking about, because the U.S. counters that and says, oh, no, this was international waters. Is this similar to, for example, when the U.S. starts to talk about the ADIZ zone around Taiwan, and like China's flying jets around it, and it's really just an international zone that sort of the U.S. drew up these boundaries. It wasn't really agreed upon internationally, but these arbitrary lines that they say, okay, this is an international zone, even though part of that ADIZ, by the way, goes over the actual mainland of China. So is it a similar zone that Russia has drawn up and said, this is our area, don't come here? Or is this truly internationally recognized Russian airspace?
Well, it's difficult for me to answer this detailed question. It's up to, I think, people who are specializing in international law. But I think that it fits also within this concept of rules-based international order of the United States. So they do not acknowledge international norms. They want to set up the norms themselves, and they want other countries to obey. But one thing is very important. This is part of the conflicting. The boundaries of this zone were known to the United States. There are situations like this when the boundaries are being announced, like, I don't know, in Syria, for example. And of course, our two countries usually try to avoid such collisions of interests and incidents that can lead to dire consequences. So this is exactly the case that was here. And the United States, the drone was heading into beyond these boundaries. And of course, it was creating a problem for us, because this is a reconnaissance drone, We know that United States is providing coordinates to the Kiev regime for artillery strikes, for rockets launching. And of course, we're not interested in the United States poking its nose in Crimea for such purposes. So we had
Right.
every right to intercept such a provocation. And what happened exactly from technical point of view, I think it can be determined by aviation experts. Maybe some video footage will give some results, but none of our jets was damaged as it was initially claimed by the United States.
Yeah, it sounds almost. I mean, if that's true that the Russian fighter jet did not come into contact with this drone at all, then it sounds to me, with the transponders being off and with it kind of flying around recklessly and then plunging in the water, that maybe they just lost control of this thing, and they're using that as now a narrative to kind of continue this war posturing rhetoric, which is what we just heard from the general, really aggressive language. So, I guess there's always an opportunity to try to stoke more, stoke the flames a bit more. So, regarding the actual war itself that's going on, I know from the Russian perspective it's a special operation. Where do you think this is headed now? Do you think we're actually getting reports here in the United States now? Washington Post even just recently put out an article saying that Ukraine is not doing well. This was, the narrative here in the United States has been this whole time that Ukraine is doing great and pushing back on the Russians, and we got to keep it up. Now they're saying things aren't so great. There's a lot of losses. The troops are untrained. The ones that they're recruiting to come on are afraid. They don't want to do this. They're running out of ammunition. Do you believe that the West's support for Ukraine is going to dwindle down, and there's going to be a resolution between Russia and Ukraine, as we see now Xi Jinping going to speak to President Putin and also to President Zelensky? Or do you think that this is grounds for an argument for NATO troops to actually get in there and turn this into a hot war between NATO and Russia?
Well, I would like, of course, not to see the last scenario that you floated to come true, because it would be dangerous for the whole world. We all understand the risks. We all understand what's at stake if there is a direct involvement of NATO troops in this situation. As for the state of things right now, you're absolutely right. I think that the Ukrainian troops are now in a very poor situation, and this is quite clear from a lot of video reels in Telegram, in particular. I think that we're using this source of information about special military operation. A lot of confessions, a lot of indications that Ukrainian troops are really suffering heavy losses, that the new conscripts are being used as cannon fodder after 2-3 days of training. I think that the Zelensky regime has become a hostage of its own policy and of its promises to Western countries that it is capable of winning militarily over Russia, provided it is being supplied by weapons. So now the task of Zelensky regime is clearly to show that Ukraine is capable of counteroffensive, and this counteroffensive has been announced for a long time. And they don't want any image damage to their image. So the situation around Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk, as we call it, is really very bad for Ukraine. There are a lot of troops that are on the brink of being encircled. The casualties are immense. It's hard to imagine how many people they lose. They are throwing them one after another, 100 after 100, just to support the prestige of President Zelensky and his promises to the West that Ukraine will be capable of winning over Russia and of launching counteroffense. And this counteroffense is important because this is a precondition, as far as I understand, for continuous Western support. So this is criminal, this is tragic, and of course it is all avoidable. We said from the very beginning that we would be ready to negotiate and to agree on realistic terms of coming to peace, but we need to see that our neighbor is peaceful, that it is not threatening Russian Federation anymore, that it is not oppressing Russian-speaking population, that it is not shelling the residents of Donbass, killing women and children and elderly, that this our neighbor also would be ready to not to glorify the former collaborators of Nazis, and that the ideology of this country would be changed, because in the way it is right now, it is absolutely Russophobic, it's anti-Russian, and it is very nationalist, even if we put aside this anti-Russian element. This is very Nazi ideology, and I had recently an interview where I went in depth about the origins of Ukrainian nationalism, and I don't think a lot of people in the West really realize what's the real face of this monster, which has been resurrected by the active efforts of United States and its allies, starting from 2004 and especially actively in 2014. So that's what we're having now. And well, we have reports every day that there are advances of Russian troops. The weather conditions are also not in the favor of Ukrainian army, because they can't use heavy machines for their tasks. So I think we are on the eve of quite serious military developments there, not in the favor of Ukraine. I don't know how they will cope with this and what will they tell to their Western sponsors. But I think that these sponsors also are to blame, and they play a very important part in this Ukrainian tragedy, ongoing tragedy of the whole country and its people, because President Zelensky is absolutely not having in mind Ukrainian interests. Ukraine is just a pawn in Western geopolitical interests, and I don't think that the West is really knowing what to do after that.
Speaking of Ukraine being a pawn in the kind of greater ideas of NATO expansion in the West, recently President Putin just stated that this war is not just a war, it's that he said, quote, "We're fighting for the very existence of our country." Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Let's just say in some land, in some universe, that Russia were to completely lose this, that Ukraine were to go and take over Donbass, go and take over Crimea, completely, win in the vision that Zelensky keeps saying that that's the only way to win. What does that mean for Russia? How would that be something that's very detrimental to the existence of Russia?
Well, I think that this imaginary universe, it exists in the heads of a lot of Western politicians. I think yesterday, Canadian Foreign Minister Joly, if I'm not mistaken, said also that the final task of the West strategy is the regime change in Russia. I think that this is absolutely clear. So Ukraine is just a tool to weaken Russia. It was clear from the outset. It was clear also when we learned from Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande that they were not thinking one moment about making Ukraine implement Minsk agreements, but it was only a guise, a smokescreen for them to arm Ukraine and to prepare it for a war with Russia. Also, you need to listen to some politicians and deputies from Poland, from Baltic states, and also from so-called Russian non-systemic opposition, which is given a platform in these countries. So the leaders of this opposition are quite openly discussing the idea of dismembering Russia, of creating several countries instead of one Russia, and these countries being under the control of the West, providing with the resources and not making any political requirements. I don't think I need to elaborate on this, but you must understand that this is about the existence of our country. So if these plans are to materialize, and Ukraine was just one of the tools of this plan, of course, the very existence of our country would be put in question. I'm absolutely sure that we will avoid such a scenario. I don't see any reasons for concern militarily whatsoever, regardless of all this Ukrainian and Western propaganda that we can see on the pages of mainstream media. And even there, as you rightly pointed out, we see a lot of sober publications about what's happening there. It's also about, what my president also meant was that Ukrainian nationalism, not Ukrainians. Never speaking about doing away with Ukraine as a country, about Russification, for example, of Ukrainians. No, we are quite happy with Ukrainians being there. But the Ukrainian nationalism as ideology is very much anti-Russian. It's the backbone of Ukrainian nationalism. That's why if we put up with the existence of Ukrainian nationalism, we will understand that this ideology will always be anti-Russian. And there are a lot of very awful things that are happening now in Ukraine. I saw, for example, in Tucker Carlson's program, several very sober accounts of what's happening in terms of democracy in Ukraine, which was absolutely oppressed by Zelensky. A lot of people, a lot of those who dare to defend their rights and their identity, they are put in prison, they are tortured. We can't account for their fate. There are several persons that we really invited for our Security Council meetings, and we know that they are in Ukrainian prisons. We don't know what is happening with them. And one last thing also, which is awful and which can potentially lead to very serious bloodshed, is the decision to expel the monks and the priests from one of the most sacred places for Orthodox Christianity, the Kievo-Pechorin Lavra in Kiev. So Zelensky regime gave ultimatum to the priests and the monks of 2 weeks, and then they will expel them by force. And you need to understand that this is really the place where everything started for Russian Orthodox religion. This is a sacred place, and there are a lot of people who would come to defend it. And this will be not only enormous sacrilege, but it will be also a move that would make bear split in the Ukrainian society itself. I'm not speaking about Russia right now. It's about Ukrainian society. So the Zelensky regime wants to impose this political project of another Orthodox church, and wants to steal all the objects that are in the possession of canonic Orthodox Church, and give them to the imposters, to political organization. This is happening in front of the eyes of the whole world, and Western countries are not paying any attention to this. It's only Russia that is trying to raise this issue. We organized Security Council meeting on this. So this is really heinous what is happening, what is about to happen, and I hope that there will be no bloodshed. But the situation is very serious. Just to understand that for this regime there is nothing sacred. They can sacrifice their identity, they can sacrifice all the Russian-speaking population, they can sacrifice their own country interests for the benefit of the interests of the NATO. You remember Zelensky saying that he's expecting NATO to come and defend Ukraine, and he's expecting U.S. parents to send their children to Ukraine to defend it from Russia. So these are his plans. He wants NATO to get involved. This is a beneficial scenario for him, because otherwise he understands that Ukraine is bankrupt from any point of view, and from military point of view as well. They have squandered already several armies. So he wants a provocation. He did it already once. You remember this missile which went to Poland, and Zelensky immediately claimed that this is a Russian missile, that NATO needs to invoke Article 5 and to get directly in war with Russia. It was only by chance that really the leaders of some countries said, "Look, guys, we need to stop and see, because this is something that we can't afford." And it turned out to be that this is a Ukrainian missile, and Ukrainians knew about this. So this was a deliberate provocation. That's his plan. That's his scenario. And we can't coexist, of course, with such a neighbor. We want a normal country that is not threatening us, that is not threatening everybody. And we respect Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, we respect Ukrainian language. You will see a lot of Ukrainian cultural institutions in Russia. You will see Ukrainian language, one of official languages in Crimea, by the way. So that's the situation how I see it right now.
Yeah, well, thank you. I certainly agree with you. I hope this doesn't turn religious. If it turns into a religious war, then it gets much, much worse once you start adding that element into it. So that is a very dangerous
They are ready
escalation.
for this. They are ready for this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's when all bets are off. When things go religious, I think we've seen this around the world. That it's very, very dangerous. So, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us and giving us the perspective from your viewpoint, from Russia's viewpoint on this whole thing. One thing I can say is there's
Thank you,
definitely
Kim.
no doubt that the Black Sea is very far away from the United States. So I would like to see the U.S. kind of stop these provocations. Would be definitely one step in the right direction.
I
So,
totally agree. Totally
yeah,
subscribe to your point of view. Thank
thank
you.
you.